Thank you, Acting Deputy President. On a day when the whole question of Infrastructure Australia has been so much to the fore as it has this evening, I thought it interesting to reflect on some of my own observations in this area and some of the work being done in the past. Of course, Acting Deputy President, there are three pillars, as we know, upon which sustainable infrastructure must be built. The first is economic sustainability, the second is environmental sustainability, and the third is social sustainability. And of course, any project that doesn't measure up to all three of those aspects is arguable shouldn't proceed. And we've had robust debate this evening, even in committee, on that question. The Coalition's investment in infrastructure is based upon two core principles having regard for those pillars. The first is that the project should be aligned to state priorities, and the second is that the project should be of national importance. Acting Deputy President, it was in July of 2012 that I reported on a Senate inquiry from the Education, Employment and then Workplace Relations References Committee on the shortage of engineering and related employment skills in Australia. And the terms of reference related to the demand for infrastructure delivery, the shortage of engineering and related employment skills in Australia, in which we looked at the issues associated with the delivery of infrastructure in terms of economic development, cost efficiency, safety and disputation. Secondly, the impact of long-term outsourcing of engineering activities by government and retention in both the private and government sectors to address the skill shortage for engineers and those in the related trades, and of course the options for infrastructure development. What was interesting and relevant, Acting Deputy President, was that evidence that was presented to us, which we repeated in our report, was that an estimated $5 billion a year was lost on either poor document preparation, poor tender allocation, poor execution of projects, and indeed having to then go back and redo the work afterwards. Subsequently, I had representation in my office of a number of major project managers who said to me when we first saw that figure of $5 billion a year, we couldn't believe it. So we sat down and started talking around the table, and they said, not only were you right, but we think that there's an added $5 billion of cost in litigation associated with that original $5 billion. We made some recommendations at that time, and those people who may be listening to this evening would be very, very welcome to go and find out some of those recommendations. But it was in Senate estimates subsequently that I engaged with the then Infrastructure Australia Commissioner, Mr Michael Deegan, on this very question. I asked him had they in fact had a look at it. Now, I want to record, if I may, this evening, Mr Acting Deputy President, my appreciation for the work done by Mr Michael Deegan. I always found him to be an incredibly erudite, knowledgeable witness in Senate estimates. He never seemed to come along ever with any assistance with him. He didn't even seem to have notes, and if I saw him in estimates, or I saw him in Kalgoorlie in Western Australia addressing industry, or I saw him in Perth addressing local governments and others, I continued to be impressed by this man's grasp of his knowledge. Anyhow, he then determined, having learnt the results of our committee, he determined to engage the services of Caravel and the Melbourne Business School to look further into this question of whether that $5 or $10 billion was in fact real. And what was interesting, Acting Deputy President, was the fact that as a result of that work, Caravel and the Melbourne Business School surveyed industry and government senior executives as to how they thought they went with project definition and project completion. By their own standards, and this is self-appraisal of a survey, they found that less than 50%, only 48% of projects met their baseline time, their cost and their quality objectives for major infrastructure projects here in Australia. And what was interesting, of course, as they said in their report, the inconvenient truth is that despite the massive effort expended by industry and government, it's estimated that only 10% improvement has occurred in a 20-year period. But what was interesting was that initially people would blame poor project management. In fact, the overwhelming point to come out of the Caravel work is that it wasn't project management, it was project governance. Indeed, that was failing. It was the fact that those highly experienced engineers and others from the past who would have once overseen the project managers were in fact not there. And they themselves allocated 9 key performance indicators associated with governments, and they assessed themselves against those 9 performance indicators, giving themselves a performance scorecard. And that performance scorecard, Acting Deputy President, they judged themselves at 24% against their own key performance indicators. And you might sort of say, well, where does that relate in terms of dollars? Well, it was absolutely incredible. It's been estimated that the annual capital spend on infrastructure in Australia is about $215 billion, of which 155 in the private sector, 60 for governments. And of course, as we know, our Prime Minister, Mr Abbott, has claimed strongly that he will be an infrastructure Prime Minister, so we can expect those dollars to go up. Now, that 48% failure or 52% success, together with a 40% cost overrun, which the major companies and major government executives agreed happened, is causing us an estimated $30 billion of capital wastage each year, Acting Deputy President, and double that figure in operational waste. These figures are astounding. Not the $5 billion that we identified or the $5 billion with litigation, but indeed $30 billion in capital waste and another $60 billion in operational waste. And the point being made, if we could just improve the success rate by a measly 10%, it would yield a $9 billion saving. They estimated NPV lost $40 billion per annum, representing 2.3% of GDP. So it was very, very timely, I think, that we undertook that original inquiry. It was very timely that we engaged in that conversation with Infrastructure Australia, and I would certainly commend to those involved in expenditure in infrastructure in this country to get hold of that report by Caravel and the Melbourne Business School and study it very, very closely. The conclusions, Acting Deputy President, that project governance is not supporting effective project execution, that failure of governance is having a major impact on the Australian economy, its GDP, shareholder and, of course, taxpayer value, that the message is not getting through, that on top of project management we need that overarching experience of project governance. The fact that we need both government and individual performance. They're not being measured, and what you don't measure you can't manage. And as we all know, Acting Deputy President, what you can't manage you can't change. What you can't change you can't improve. What was interesting, of course, is the fact, as came out in the conclusions of this report, that there is a lot of potential benefit for modest investment. We are talking about bringing back often semi-retired senior engineers, not to be involved on the day-to-day project management, but to cast the slide ruler over the project management, to have a look at every aspect, to take a look at the risk aspects and just see where things may be going wrong. Senator Mark Bishop and I had the opportunity to meet with the Under-Secretary for Defence Acquisition in the Pentagon last November. This lady had responsibility for a budget of $360 billion US, which is not much short, as you know, of the entire Australian revenue budget. And we were talking to her about this very question of project governance, and she took on board the sorts of activities that Senator Bishop was referring to, as we have done in the defence area. So, Acting Deputy President, at a time when we are certainly seeing infrastructure projects building, when we're seeing a much greater investment and a much greater focus and attention, I urge that some of those conclusions of that Caravel report find their way into policy and decision-making of our government.
Thank you, Senator Back.